So welcome to the Institute of Advanced Studies. For anyone who's unfamiliar with the IAS, our main aim is to support a dynamic interdisciplinary research environment and bring international researchers to Loughborough to collaborate with our research community. Our residential programme brings international researchers to the university for a month, and we're delighted to be hosting Alexandros Kioupkiolis, who's an Associate Professor of Contemporary Political Theory at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. To find out about the work of the IAS and how you can get involved with what we do, you can visit our website, which is elborough.ac.uk/research/IAS. So we're running this as a hybrid event. So we've got a group of people here in the room at International House and others joining online. This Zoom webinar format automatically turns off your audio and video. Sorry about that. But you can still post comments in the chat, and you can also use the Q&A function. If you can remember to use the Q&A function for any questions, that will help us to field those at the end, because they'll all be in the same place then. And we'll try and pick those up at the end of the webinar. So we're looking forward to a really interesting talk today and Q&A. I'll hand over to Dr. Georgios Katsambekis, who is a lecturer in European and International Politics and founded the Populism Research Group, I believe, at Loughborough, to introduce Alexandros and his work.
Thank you, Katie. And I must say that you have a talent in pronouncing Greek names. So both of them quite close, really good job. So I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank the IAS for hosting Alex. And I can say is an associate professor at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. He's an excellent colleague and a good friend. For quite a few years now, more than 10 years, I think, I've known Alex. A bit of background, Alex studied in Greece, took his BA at the University of Athens, continued here in the UK, his MA at the University of Essex, and then his PhD at the University of Oxford. And he's been doing a lot of work on radical political theory, the commons, social movements, the concept of radical democracy, contemporary progressive manifestations of populism as well. And this has been reflected in numerous publications. I think it's worth mentioning here Alex's two monographs in English. Let me make sure that I remember the titles correctly here. So the more recent monograph, which I think is more closely related to what Alex will be talking about today, is the one titled The Commons and Counter-hegemonic Politics with Edinburgh University Press. 2.5 years ago, this one was published. And then the other monograph, Freedom After the Critique of Foundations. Alex, of course, has published numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals, so I couldn't, if I had to pick out some of them, people can Google his latest publication in the journal Politics with Sage, which I think is the one on which Alex will be drawing for today, but also a couple of more articles, one the Social Movement Studies Journal, and another one, if I remember correctly, in Contemporary Political Theory. Alex, you can correct me here if I don't remember correctly the latest publications. And Alex has also co-edited a couple of collective volumes that are quite relevant here. So Radical Democracy and Collective Movements Today, 2014, and The Populist Radical Left in Europe, 2019. So people can check the EAS webpage, the webpage that EAS has created for Alex, for his fellowship, and they can find more stuff there. So without further ado, I'm happy to give the floor to Alex.
Okay, thank you all, both for your introduction and for inviting and hosting me here in this center. It was a very good, very friendly environment, and was a good opportunity for me to further pursue my research and writing during this month. The paper that I will present is basically the outcome, the latest outcome of a quite long research starting in almost 10 or even more years ago. And it reflects my main research interests and concerns and questions, as you will see. But before beginning my presentation, I'd like to apologize for the fact that I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, and this is not just because I'm lazy, it's because in the tradition of political theory, even contemporary political theory, which I belong and with which I identify, normally we don't do PowerPoint presentations. There's a whole rationale behind this. However, I could share the text on which I will draw if you want me to, if you enable this function. I don't know, because here it doesn't work. Sharing it has been disabled.
You should be able to transfer it now.
Okay. Yep. Here we are. Okay. So can you see this text? Counter-hegemonic leadership for democratic politics. Okay, fine. I will not be reading just simply this text, but I will definitely follow the line of reasoning here and the main arguments. So my presentation will revolve around, has actually three main topics. The first one is this theme of alter politics. This refers to democratic alter politics. This refers to forms of democratic mobilization and participation that have emerged in recent years, actually the last 30 years, in response to the circumstances of neoliberal hegemony, austerity policies in several countries, the policy of the economics of globalization. And it has this alter politics, as I will analyze it, has some distinctive features that make it differentiate actually from both mainstream politics in contemporary liberal democracies, but also from conventional forms of activism in the 20th century. So one main topic is this issue of alter politics. What does it mean? What forms it manifests? It has manifested itself. The second topic, closely related to the first one, is the question of strategy. Which are the strategic challenges facing the growth and expansion of democratic alter politics in our times? And the last, and perhaps the main topic, and perhaps the most innovative part of this presentation, will be the question of alter political leadership, forms of collective and egalitarian and distributed leadership that have emerged from within these recent democratic movements, and that seek to address the strategic, to tackle the strategic challenges that I will point out, and that by constructing different modalities of democratic leadership, forms of democratic leadership which are not centralized, are not vertical, top-down, and so on and so forth, and hence they are in line, they accord with the egalitarian, anti-hierarchical spirit of democratic alter politics. Perhaps you are familiar with this prefix of alt. It is used in contemporary politics. It is used mainly in relationship to the alt-right. So this form of alter politics that we're talking about is on the opposite side. It's completely opposed to the alt-right. And the use of the same prefix, alter, actually, in this case, is deliberate. It wants to highlight, the aim is to highlight the idea that we have alternative politics that are not xenophobic, nationalist, and so on and so forth. So let me start. what is this alter politics about? It's a form of political intervention and political mobilization that we can find in a series of movements and protests, starting with the Zapatistas uprising in the early 90s, and moving on to the cycle of protests, the Arab Spring, and the European South and the North America with the Occupy and the Indignado movement in 2011. But the same political logic can be found across several other civic initiatives and practices, even in internet online communities. This type of democratic mobilization, participation, and structure is defined by a set of specific features. Alter political activity pays attention to process, to the political process, and it seeks to construct egalitarian social relations and institutions here and now. It is a pragmatic form and approach to politics that is usually rooted in specific local communities or national context, but at the same time, it seeks to build global connections and solidarity and networks. And its main difference from mainstream politics is its opposition to hierarchies and formal hegemonic types of political representation and top-down leadership on the one hand, and on the other hand, in comparison to typical forms of activism, is the attempt to move beyond an emphasis on protest alone or on demands of the state, and also an attempt to reject ideological dogmatism or this posture of coming forward as a vanguard that will lead the revolution, and so on and so forth. I will explain in greater detail these distinctive features of alter politics. Now, the question that is raised very often, especially in recent years, in relation to these different instances of democratic alter politics that can be found in contemporary movements and civic practices, is whether this can scale up and bring about a broader social, political, and economic transformation by challenging the hegemony of neoliberalism and the more standard and entrenched features of liberal institutions who tend to be hierarchical and exclude massive popular mobilization and participation. So that's how I will move on to the question of strategy after describing in greater detail the content and the forms of what I call here, following an anthropologist, alter politics. So the term has been introduced, actually, to my knowledge at least, in 2015, this term of alter politics, by the anthropologist of the Australian anthropologist Gus and Haas, who has written a book with his title and many papers. And he has noted the emergence of a radical imaginary of what he calls alter politics, starting from the salience of ecological questions and the feminist slogan, the personal is political. He argued that these ideas, the politics of ecology and the politics of feminism, have culminated in the development of a different style of political mobilization in 2012, 2011 in the Indignados and Occupy movements. And this is my quote from Haas: "It is very clear that we're increasingly moving into an era in which the radical imaginary is starting to be as dominated by the problematic of the alternative as it is with the problematic of the opposition, as alter as it is anti. Existing struggles that have generated an endless stalemate are increasingly requiring a new politics that comes from outside the existing space of conventional political possibility." So the alternative of this alter politics of the politics of such social movements consists in a difference both from mainstream party politics, but also from conventional, from conventional activism. And another, a Canadian political theorist and activist using a very similar term, other politics, not alter politics, other politics, but the notion is the same, has offered a very detailed account of this, of the features of this alter politics in recent years. So this is Chris Dixon, and he has authored a book, published a book under this title of Other Politics. But the ideas that we can find and the characteristics that he attributes to other politics in his own account can be also found in diverse other theories in recent years, in the work of political theorist Raymond Coles, the feminist theorist Gibson and Graham, Christine Kaufman, and perhaps most known examples are is the work of Hart and Engel, and also in literature, recent literature on social movements such as the Quince or Indignados movement and municipalism in Spain. We find very similar accounts of the features and the content of this democratic alter politics. So, how can we? What are these features? Dixon has argued that we find at the center of alter politics, democratic alter politics, we find this attempt to combine opposition with proposition. There is this democratic alter politics, think of the Occupy movement or the Quince or Indignados movement in Spain. They were a protest, an attempt to challenge actual structures of domination, from racism to patriarchy and the current dominant forms of neoliberal capitalism, but also the top-down style of politics and exclusionary style of politics that is prevalent in a contemporary liberal democracy. So they oppose all the different forms of different structures and logics of oppression and domination. But this opposition is combined with an attempt to construct new social relations and new types of politics, political participation in the very process of struggling itself, bridging means with ends, and prefiguring, that is, anticipating another more egalitarian democratic world. Hence, alter politics is intrinsically a politics that brings into existence, generates other patterns of interaction and other types of social relations, creating counter-institutions such as food and housing cooperatives or egalitarian movements that are based on participatory democracy and are typically governed by general assemblies and decision-making seeking consensus. So we have this combination of opposition with proposition, the type of prefigurative politics that is characteristic of several social movements, politics that anticipate in their own practices here and now their end or their vision of a different world with more equality, freedom, care for the environment, gender equality, and so on and so forth. But this prefigurative politics is combined further with an attempt to construct broader massive organizations, enduring social movements, and counter-institutions, alternative institutions, which can act strategically here and now for broader social change. This entails also a pragmatic term in alter politics, certain political and strategic pragmatism, because pursuing broader change within and trying to build massive movements in the current circumstances requires failures. It is bound to face different failures. It requires also constant experimentation and diversity of tactics and strategic plans. So the theories of this type of other or alter politics have argued that what we can see in the different instances of alter politics is what they call a visionary pragmatism, which combines first street politics and protests with second everyday action and an attempt to engage with established institutions in order to meet pressing social needs from health, question of precarious immigration, precarious labor, the question of housing, and so on and so forth, with third, long-term visions and strategies of reconstructing society in order to create a different world. As a result, alter politics has this defining feature that it moves beyond the alternative reform or revolution. It is both radical in its aspirations and its movement, its tendency, but it's also reformist and pragmatic in its everyday politics. However, what informs all these different instances and manifestations of alter politics, the protests, the creation of alternative institutions, different ways of engaging or putting pressure on institutions in order to meet actual social needs, is an emphasis on grassroots mobilization and political participation of all people on equal terms in the various activities that can be characterized as alter political. The beginning of this different, the origin perhaps of this different style of politics in recent years has been traced back by many theories and analysis of social movements to the Zapatistas. They were the first social movement that articulated this idea of global politics, as politics as both global and local, that emphasizes, puts a lot of emphasis and pays a lot of attention to process, egalitarian participation, and so on and forth, grassroots democracy, but also seeks to disarticulate inherited historical dilemmas, such as reform or revolution, organization or spontaneity, opposition or proposition. They try to combine all of them. Hence, they need to be pragmatic and anti-dogmatic. This type of alter political activity is informed by a specific logic, political logic, and a distinct ethic and affect or affectivity. It has, as I said, this logic is characterized by pragmatism, also a lot of reflection and a process of ongoing reflection of what we are doing now and how this is connected to the broader aspirations or visions of radical change. And there is an ongoing attempt to maintain relations of critical respect, generosity, dialogue with different positions, and care for other people across our differences. This is different logic and ethic and affect that I described, draws a lot on the feminist critique of the macho militant of the 20th and the 19th century, and its ethic of sacrifice, commitment, militant spirit, military spirit, and so on and so forth. Hence, some people, such as the theorists, I think Brian Masumi and Montgomery and Bergman, have introduced this notion of joyful militancy, which rejects the traditional figure of a rigid, zealous, and masculine militant, and combines struggle with joy, struggle with fragility, recognition of fragility, and prioritizes relationships over social and human relationships over abstract ideologies. Now, moving to the second topic, which is the question of strategy. All this may sound very nice, quite promising, quite radical in its democratic potential or principles, but we know that all these different initiatives, movements, and so on, they have faced many important challenges and limits, and they have failed so far on a global, but even on a national level, to bring about broader social transformation in the direction of their principles and values. And of course, there are many reasons for this failure, including individualism, social fragmentation, enduring attachments, emotional attachments, emotional attachments to the status quo and neoliberal values, the precarization of labor, insecurity, an order of surveillance, and a global order of competition and complexity, along with widespread discourses of no alternative, there is no alternative to the present system. And in the last 15 years, at least in Latin America and Southern Europe, while there has been an attempt by progressive governments to promote democratic change, the failures of these governments, the failures of these parties when in government, and the failures of the movements themselves. So we can witness in the last 7-8 years in contemporary theory that is interested in alter politics, democratic alter politics, and social change in this direction. We can notice a turn to strategic questions. Why have we failed so far? How can we overcome these failures? Hard and Negri, among others, in the recent works, and more recently in the 2017 book, The Assembly, they have described a set of strategies that could help to overcome the strategic failures of alter politics, promoting what they call the principle of the common. The principle of the common is about equality, it's about grassroots democracy, it's about sharing or most collective goods, and overturning the rule of private property and top-down politics. So they have outlined 3 main strategies that, on their view, have been developed in the 19th and 20th century, and on their view, they should be combined today, actually mutually adjusted, and also mutually adjusted. The first one is what they call the exodus. And in this strategy, groups and individuals that oppose dominant institutions, they try to exit these institutions and construct in their own enclaves and smaller communities new ways of living, producing, and reproducing. So utopian communities of prefigurative politics that takes place in contemporary activism are 2 characteristic examples. They argue that all this process of creating here and now different types of social relations and new communities are important, but they tend to keep a distance from a wider social context, or alternatively, if they are integrated in wider social formations, they remain dependent on both the state and the contemporary forms of capitalism for their reproduction. So they are not actually in a position to promote broader social change. And they also lack the means and the will to engage with existing institutions in order to reshape them. The second strategy, what they call antagonistic reformism, engages with these institutions, with institutions of the state and the market from within, and seeks to reconstruct them through what they call a long march through the institutions that can take the form of participation in elections, of taking power, or legal projects. And Hardenegger argued that the main limitation of antagonistic reformism consists in existing institutional constraints and bureaucratic co-optation or inertia. That usually ends up changing the very people who wanted to change the institutions. The final strategy is what they call hegemony, but in reality, this term coincides in their thought with revolution. And revolution means taking in the historical sense, it means taking power through an insurrection or with violent means. They also dismiss, to a large extent, this approach because they argue that it tends to reproduce hierarchies and inequalities, a division of society into rulers and ruled. For Hadar-Negri, the question is not simply to take power, but to change power as we take it. And they also argue that today there is very little scope for this kind of revolutionary politics because of the constraints that are imposed by the global economy and the international institutions. So, what can we do if we want to come up with effective strategies to promote alter politics, to help them expand and transform our current social relations and institutions? Their answer is, we need, first of all, to combine the three strategies, which should be seen as they argue, as a three-phased Dionysus to govern the common, and which, of course, adjust them mutually because they have differences and even conflicts. And that's one part of the solution. The other is, or their strategic proposal, and the other is that we should anchor all political activity and political strategy in society and in new social developments that take place today and that move in this direction of what they call the common, that is, of goods that are shared, produced, and managed collectively for the common benefit, as we can see on online processes, for instance, Wikipedia and free software, or new forms of cooperative labor. They argue that these processes that are now taking place in society and the economy should guide and sustain and support any kind of political activity. So political activity, in the narrow sense, should be based on this new practice of collaboration and sharing, and should take its strategic cues, let's put it that way, from these new processes. Now, I will not go on with I will not insist on this critique of Hadar-Negri approach. There are many problematical issues in their strategic reflection. But the main one, in my view, is they do not address the question of agency, how we will build a collective subject or a collective or a broader coalition that will be committed to a large-scale project of social change and will follow and realize and combine intelligently the three strategies of exodus, antagonistic reformism, and revolution. And this is the main question today for many of the theorists and activists of alter politics. How do we build a broader social actor, political actor for change? It has been put in a very good way clear way by the late American US sociologist Eric Olin Wright, who has argued that in 2018, at the year when he died, this is one of the last essays that he wrote, and he concluded this with this question. The title of the essay is How to be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. And at the end of his analysis, he raises this question, and he answers that I cannot provide an adequate answer because it remains the main question for political, for transformative action and strategy today. And the problem is the following. In some ways, I quote, in some ways, the most vexing problem for the strategic vision of eroding capitalism is how to create collective actors with sufficient coherence and capacity for struggle to sustain over time the project of challenging capitalism. It is not enough to have a solid diagnosis, a critique of the world as it is. It is not even enough to map the strategies that would move us in the right directions. For those alternatives to be actually achievable, there must be political agents of transformation capable of bringing them about using those strategies. So where are these collective actors? And his response is that they are collective actors, but moving in different directions. We have like far-right wing movements and so on, and we have like right-wing and xenophobic populism, but we don't have a massive subject and actor for a democratic alter political change. So what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes, as I'm moving to the end, is to try to provide just a part of some hints for an answer to how we can build such a collective subject, and how we can organize effectively to promote alter political change. I think that we can, a very important source for thinking strategically remains the theory of hegemony put forward by Antonio Gramsci and then renewed and revised by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. Hegemony is precisely a theory about strategy that helps to construct a massive collective subject and organization for social change. For Gramsci, what we need is a committed political organization that will assume that functions and tasks of leadership and will bring together a multiplicity of actually existing social struggles and activities that meet social needs in order to build a new collective identity and to form a common political program that will create a new common sense and will disseminate new values and ideas, promoting a broader struggle and process of change. And this idea has been, of course, endorsed and renewed by strategic idea, and renewed by Laclau and Mouffe, who have dismissed parts of the Marxist part of Gramsci, and have tried to conceptualize hegemony in more pluralist terms and more formal terms. And in their thought as well, the emphasis is on a certain social force, existing social force, moving out of its particular identity and assuming broader functions of leadership and organization, building coalitions and imputing wider political meanings to social practice and existence. I will not dwell on this point of what hegemony consists more specifically in their thought. What I want to do in order to conclude is to say how we have seen in contemporary social movements attempts to reconstruct the politics, reshape the politics of hegemony, which is a politics of leadership, of building an organization that will lead a broader process of social change. So in recent social movements, there have been attempts to both assume this function of leadership, but also to transform it in line with the principles of bottom-up self-organization and equality, openness, those that I described at the beginning as being the content of alter politics. Because in the type of hegemonic politics envisioned by Gramsci and Laclau and Mouffe, we have quite strong elements of hierarchy and centralization of power. So Gramsci's political party is centralized. The party is the hegemonic force in Gramsci's thought. In Laclau and Mouffe, the hegemonic force need not be a party, but it still needs to exercise top-down power over an allied bloc of forces. Now, these ideas of concentrating power at the top run counter to the egalitarian dispositions of contemporary social movements. However, these movements have tried in specific ways to both assume the function of leadership and to transform it along the lines of, as I said, equality, openness, and bottom-up self-organization. So the main way that they have tried to do this is through the is by insisting on assembly-based decision-making. So yes, we are trying to initiate other social movements. For instance, we are trying to initiate processes of social exchange and to create a broader social coalition. This is precisely the task of a hegemonic force in Gramsci's and Laclau and Mouffe's thought, but we do it through an open assembly in which anyone could take part and decide collectively on equal terms how we will lead this process of change. And they followed specific procedures within these assemblies in order to make sure that no new hierarchy, to make sure that within these assemblies we don't have the emergence of new hierarchies and informal leaders. Among others, they moderated very strictly this discussion. They limited the time to speaking, the time of speaking, and they used lots to allocate the time to speak. So a whole series of methodologies and practices through which the power of co-deciding is shared within an assembly. Of course, as both activists and theorists have noted, the assembly form as a way of leading, as a way of exercising leadership in a collective and egalitarian way, has its own limits and tensions. It can be, and it is, time and energy consuming. It excludes people who need to work, who need to take care of other people, home or elsewhere. And also the commitment to consensus can be problematic, giving undue power to minorities or just a handful of individuals that block decisions by exercising their right to veto. So social movements such as the Quince or Indignados movement in Spain have, to address these limits of the assembly model, have tried to combine it with what they call technopolitics, that is, a process of making decisions together and co-shaping politics by using digital networks and platforms through which we can coordinate action without being physically present in a common space. And a lot has been written about the use of digital media in recent popular mobilizations, and in effect, this use of digital media has indeed allowed large groups of people to self-organize and to take political initiative without relying on a centralized organization and without needing to be physically present in a specific space. However, digital media of collective decision-making that is open potentially to all those interested has its own problems, and these have been illustrated in a very stark and illuminating way in the case of the Spanish party Podemos, which emerged from the mobilization of 2011 and 12 in Spain, and used digital media in order to have to enable a more massive participation in its ranks. However, in the end, the use of technopolitics in the party ended up reasserting the authority of the leader over a small, narrow cycle of leaders within the party. So this is not a panacea, the use of digital media, and has always to be combined with both physical presence and another set of rules and practices that can control and check the power of leaders and distribute power more widely. As we are running out of time, I think I'll mention very briefly 2-3 more points about alter political leadership, the ways that new social movements and initiatives try to collectivize leadership and to transform it and make it more equal, more open, more participatory. There is also, this is the in addition to the assembly and digital means there is an emphasis on specific processes and rules and procedures through which we can effectively distribute power and avoid its concentration in certain persons and groups. And these methods are permanent, are revocability, the attempt to assure the full transparency decision-making, short-term mandates when there is a need for such mandates, a rotation in leadership rules, and then the primacy of the General Assembly when we need to make the key decisions for our political action. The third innovation, the third component in this attempt to transform, the fourth component in this attempt to transform leadership and make it more collective and egalitarian, is the attempt to cultivate a different ethic of leadership in line with the formula, the motto of the Zapatistas, leading by obeying. So there is an attempt to transform personal leaders into actually the servants of the community, rather than people who concentrate power and privilege in their hands, by cultivating a different mentality that makes leaders more humble and that drives them to actually serve the community and to help other people take initiative rather than asserting power and authority. And the last point, and here I'm actually closing, is the so-called feminization of leadership and politics, which is very pronounced in particular in Latin American and Spanish social movements in the last 10, 15 years. But this feminization of politics and leadership, they don't mean simply that positions of power and leadership are taken up by women. It is something more profound and important going on, in the sense that the feminization of leadership is an attempt to create a different mentality and a different approach to leadership in many different respects, and not simply in terms of gender equality as to who assumes position of leadership. One of the most important examples of this feminist leadership in recent years has been the case of Ada Colau in Barcelona, who is now the mayor of Barcelona, has been the mayor since 2015. And for her, this feminized leadership means, I will conclude with this. It means focus. It means that we should focus on proximity to people in their neighborhoods, and we should connect intimately with them as a group that exercises leadership in the city. We should connect intimately with them in their everyday realities. We should promote the self-organization of people in neighborhoods and the city. We should privilege concrete action over ideology. And finally, we should make different struggles, anti-sexist, anti-racist, anti-homophobic struggles, and so on, converge around the question of justice, equality, freedom, and participation in all sides of decision making. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your patience so far.